Hello, this is Raf Alvarado, and welcome to Exploratory Text Analytics. In this video, we're going to look at some examples of topic models that we discussed previously more abstractly. So we're going to go over 4 examples. This is just really scratching the surface of how topic models have been used, not only within the humanities, but much more broadly. So let's look at this one from Richmond, Virginia, University of Richmond by Robert Nelson, an historian there. It's called Mining the Dispatch. Basically, this is a 40 topic model using Mallet, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, applied to the Richmond Times-Dispatch, the newspaper of record for Richmond, Virginia, from November 1860 to April 1865. So that's basically the beginning and end of the U.S. Civil War, and for those who don't know, Richmond, Virginia was the capital of the Confederacy during that period. And what this topic model does, applied to all these newspaper articles, which by the way are a perfect example of the kind of text that we're interested in for lots of reasons, it identifies some pretty clear themes and shows their frequency over time. And this is one of the uses of topic models that I'm particularly interested in, which is how, in a way, you can think of topic frequencies in corpora that have a time value. In other words, newspapers all have a date. When you lay out their topic distributions over time, you really have what I like to call a social sensor. And you see this with lots of different kinds of media. You can actually see it with Twitter, for example. Certain things trend and decline, and you're just getting this these responses almost like an instrument that's measuring waves of a certain kind or energy outputs from something. This is a great project too, because there's a nice interactive website that's been online. It's been around for a while, and the website's still functional though, so go check it out. Here's just a quick shot of one of the salient findings from the website, or describing what I was just describing of as a social sensor. At the top, you'll see a distribution of topics in the corpus. So it's showing you how frequent certain topics exist in the corpus of Richmond Times-Dispatch. And you can see there's a big chunk, it seems like it's almost a third, is devoted to fugitive slave ads. And then you see other slices that are of importance as well. You can see weather is the not too big, but still prominent. You've got humor in there, environment and culture, and so forth. What you have below is a chart of the distribution of those topics over time, the frequency with which they appear by month, and this is spanning from January 1861 to January of 1865. And you can see the green corresponds to the fugitive slave ads, and the blue corresponds to the for hire and wanted ads. And interestingly, you can see that there's spikes in the for hire and wanted ads at regular intervals. And it's an interesting historical question as to why that is the case. And that's something that he talks about. And if you're an historian, this is one of the things that topic modeling is helpful for, because it can give you clues about where to train your attention and about why, what's going on at a certain time and place. We'll just stop right there. There's a lot more to say about this site, both substantively and methodologically, but I leave it to you to go explore that site. The second example I'm going to give you is one by 2 authors, Matt Jockers and David Minmo, from 2013. So David Minmo is a prominent figure in digital humanities, computational digital humanities, and one of the developers of a very important tool called Mallet, which was just used in the previous example. He's a pretty important thinker in digital humanities, and I invite you to go look at his writings. Matt Jockers is also super important, and we're going to look at some of his stuff in other areas. The two have collaborated to produce a pretty interesting study of themes in 19th century literature, which has the merit of being pretty rigorous and meeting standards of the proper use of statistics and so forth. So just looking at this particular project and what its metrics are, again, Mallet is used as the tool to generate the topic model, and it's applied to a corpus of 19th century United Kingdom and United States literature, which consists of, over 3,000 novels, with a roughly even distribution of novels authored by females and authored by males, as well as some where the gender could not be determined. Now, they ran a pretty large topic model of 500, and they chunked this corpus into 631,000 or so chunks. And interestingly, they only took out the nouns. So this is where the annotation in our pipeline is very important. When you tokenize your text and then you annotate it by part of speech, you can then filter out only the parts of speech that you're interested in. And I know when we say nouns, I'm pretty sure that they also took out proper nouns, because proper nouns cluster very highly to certain authors, obviously, in certain novels, and so they don't have a lot of utility in talking about characterizing whole, corpora, such as what we're looking at here. In other words, looking at a proper name is very often similar to just looking at the title of the book, because it's so specific. So the question that they actually have is, given the topic model for this corpus, can we predict gender? In other words, are there certain topics that correlate strongly with with gender or not, which is just interesting in its own right. The other thing is that those texts that are not gendered, the ones that where the gender of the author could not be determined, is that because they're controversial in some manner, and therefore it's necessary for the author to have hidden their identities? Those are two questions that they ask of the data. And here are two findings that they developed. So on the bottom, you'll see what's a very common representation of a topic model, which is to show the language model associated with a topic as a word cloud, and with the most frequent words represented more largely, and so forth. And so, what this does is lend itself to some easy glossing of what a topic stands for, what the subject matter is. And so the one on the left is obviously the subject of dress. And the one on the right is not the subject of enemy per se, but of warfare. They've called it enemies, but it looks like warfare, and they've called the one on the left female fashion. So what you see is just a scatter plot of the association of the concentration of the mean concentration of this topic in documents associated by gender. So the mean concentration of female fashion is in documents authored by females is higher than those documented by males, and then you can see that the uncertain ones are intermediate. On the right, you see the opposite. You see that the warfare or enemies is not such a great topic for females, but it's a very great topic for males. But notice we have to condition this or pay attention to the scale on the left. They're different in these cases. But nevertheless, we do see what is possibly a statistically significant difference between the distribution of these two topics relative to the gender of the author. You can also look at words associated with the particular topics. And so there are two topics, actually in this particular topic, convent and abbey. Let's look at the word distribution and how often those words appear in text by males versus how often those words appear in text by females. And this is interesting too. You can see that in the convents and abbeys topic, the word sisterhood, sisters, nuns, etc. is more associated with text written by females. And on the bottom you can see that monks, recluse, brotherhood, hermit, but also interestingly nunnery and so forth are associated with text by males. What to make of this is interesting, but it does look like there is again a statistically significant distributional difference between or correlation between certain words in this topic and the author's gender. Here we have listed on the left the labels for the topics. So they picked 25 topics that have been glossed, and what they show on the right is its correlation with gender of the author. And so you can see that female fashion is more correlated with females than males. Let's look for one that's the opposite. Men with guns, number 16, more correlated with males than females, and so forth. And so this is what I mean by saying that You could use this as an index to get through, as a way of providing access to an exploratory access point to the corpus of novels from the United States and the United Kingdom in the 19th century. But what's really interesting about it is that independently of the novels, what it does is give you a synoptic view of culture, of what is of interest to the cultures that produced these novels. So fashion is a concept, warfare is a concept, health and illness is a concept, landlords is a concept. You're getting a kind of inventory of the world within which these novels were written. And that's very interesting. And there's other things that we can do with this as well that we're not looking at today and we're not looking at in these examples. But you can look at the correlations between topics and documents, for example, and start to build out a structural model for how these particular things are connected. But let's move on here. So the method that we use in deriving this kind of information is that what we do is we apply labels to all our documents. So you can imagine in the ordered hierarchy of contents objects index of a particular document table, you could add another column in that index that is a label such as male or female. And then what you can do is you can group by male and female and get the average of the topic distributions for each document. And then those will be representative of male and female. And within that, then you can pick out which topics are more strongly correlated with male and which are more strongly correlated with female. And you can do that with any sort of label. You could do it with nationality, or you could do it with time period. You can do it with income, any number of features that can be associated with the author or the document itself. Metadata can be used as a variable with which to compare to the topics, as long as you have the metadata that's available. So here we're looking at, this is one of the results of Mallet producing a relationship between documents. This is the theta table that we've talked about on the left and topics on the right. So this is a summarization of all the topics associated with, all the documents associated with a given author. So it's been collapsed by author. And you can see that, Austen versus Agatha Christie versus Wilkie Collins will have different concentrations of topics in their corpus. So let's look at example 3. Newspaper coverage of U.S. government arts funding, which seems a bit perhaps dry, unless you're very much interested in this particular kind of policy. I include this because it's one of the principal authors. The first author listed, Paul DiMaggio, is a prominent sociologist, established sociologist, and the fact that he has embraced the use of topic models for his research is really important, a really important validation of the method for doing serious work in the social sciences. He describes topic modeling as an inductive relational approach to the study of culture. And I encourage you to read that article to get a sense of what he means by that. So here he is applying it to a specific problem. And what he wants to do is find out if the decline in funding for the arts can be linked to the representation of arts in the media. So here we're getting into what we'll call the perlocutionary dimension of discourse, which is the effective discourse on the world, one of the facets of discourse that Ricoeur talked about way in the beginning. He wants to correlate the locutionary quality of a text, what it's about, which is the topic models, with its effects on the environment or on society here. So if the thesis is, can you correlate particular kinds of representation of art with particular funding patterns of art? He argues that topic modeling is useful here because it can detect what is called heteroglossia. Heteroglossia is also going to be of interest to the next example. And what that means is, in representing multiple topics, texts also, by virtue of that, represent multiple perspectives. And this is a very interesting concept about text that we haven't talked about, which is that text, even though we've used the fiction, as it were, of text being written by a single author and sort of being relatively simple in that sense, especially, when you think about the model that we just talked about for generating text. In reality, texts are complicated. corpora of text are very complicated because you have multiple authors that you're working with. And it's very often the case that there are many voices at work in a corpus and within a document. And these represent multiple perspectives. So, for example, in a corpus of newspaper articles, you're going to see conservative and progressive perspectives and so forth. And so the mixture model of topic modeling can help represent these things. So what he does here is he's looking at the basic trend line of interest, which is the decline in the distribution of dollars or the appropriations of dollars to the National Endowment for the Arts over time. You can see that it peaks at around 1980, just as Reagan comes into office, and then over the 1980s it declines, and then in the mid-90s it declines precipitously, which is interesting. That's during the Clinton administration. It's kind of around when the internet becomes a big thing, but we won't speculate onto causes of that now. But it plateaus with respect to the following years here. So why look at newspapers in this particular example? Well, first of all, newspapers are clues to what elites are thinking and doing. They are, a newspaper in a way is there to tell you what to think. I don't mean to be cynical about this, but when we say newspaper of record like the New York Times, that means something. It means that the newspaper is a cultural player in setting the tone for what is important, all the news that's fit to print. And also what it's doing, if you look at the direction of communication in a newspaper, you have readers and writers. The writers are conduits of the voices of powerful people. So, there are interviews with presidents, policymakers, business leaders, and so forth, celebrities. All of this kind of information is conveyed through the newspaper journalist to the reader. And so a newspaper is a real index of what elites are thinking and doing. It's not really that controversial. And I call this cultural transduction, by the way. It's an interesting way of thinking about text as transducers of information from one sector of society to another. And also, what's very important to understand is that newspapers are really designed to shape public opinion. The concept of public opinion is closely associated with the concept of newspapers. This goes back to Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America and before. So they're a really good source of text to look at in studying, culture and society. So what the authors do here is they leverage the topic models to handle heteroglossia and polysemy that we've talked about. Heteroglossia is multiple perspectives within documents. Polysemy is multiple meanings of words across documents. And also, this is a very interesting take that they have here, which they're going to make the strong assumption that the topic model that's surfaced, is related to what are called cognitive frames, which is a concept from cognitive psychology. And then they're going to take these topics as representative cognitive frames and see them as representing either conflict or what they call comparison, which is a more benign kind of frame. And that's how they're going to characterize the representation of text. Of the arts in these texts. They're also going to focus on something called topic depth, which is they're going to look at a few topics as opposed to many topics. With Minmo and Jockers used 500. Here they're using about 12 topics, and they're going to pick the top 100 words because they're interested in drilling down into the language model of each topic and focusing on these dimensions here of heteroglossia and polysemy. And they're also going to bring in TF-IDF after the fact to filter topic terms across topics, which is an interesting pipeline that they've set up. So just looking at the data, they look at every article in 5 major newspapers from the periods of 1986 to 1987 that make any reference to government support of the arts in the United States. And they look at the 2 years preceding the Mapplethorpe controversy. If you guys are not familiar with that, Mapplethorpe's art is some sexually explicit homoerotic art that was funded by the NEA and was criticized by conservatives and led to a kind of cultural war conflict, classic sort of cultural war conflict. And they go from there to the last year that a serious effort was mounted to eliminate the NEA. And for some reason that happens in those particular years. I don't know the specific political context for that off the top of my head. And here are the numbers. They use around 8,000 texts from which they pull out 55,000 unique terms with 3 million tokens after filtering, and they identify 12 topics with an alpha value of 0.1, a beta value of 0.8, and only 50 iterations, which is interesting. That's a very few set of iterations. And what they end up with are what they call 3 conflict topics, 2 local government projects and funding topics, 7 topics that are specific to the arts, genres, events, or grant purposes. And then they get the 100 highest ranked terms per topic using TF-IDF. And what they show is these 2 broad classes of topics. You see a decline in the comparison topics, which are 1, 3, and 12, and an increase in the conflict topics, 2, 5, and 8, and then they kind of equal each other over this period. So there's this decline of one and the rise of other that happens at the end of the Reagan era. You can see the peak of the conflict stuff corresponds to the end of the Reagan era, roughly. Actually, that's in the middle of the Bush 1 era. And here's what they conclude, that the tone of arts funding coverage shifts dramatically in 1989 from a celebratory focus to a focus on controversy, which persists into the 1990s, and that you see negative coverage of the NEA emerge suddenly with the election of George H.W. Bush. And these attacks are considered to be part of an internal struggle between social conservatives and moderates for the control of the Republican Party. And so the reason that these, the reasoning behind these arguments, these conclusions, can be found in the paper. So I encourage you to read it. It's a very, very salutary case, very strong use of topic modeling to push an important thesis. Well, there's some other points to be made here as well, which is that press coverage reflected 3 frames in the controversy: a focus on objectionable grants as bureaucratic errors, a focus on congressional efforts to punish the NEA, and a view of debates over the NEA as a front in a larger culture war, which displaced the first over the course of the 1990s. So you can see that the way the framing can be seen to shift over time. So what's happening here is a much more sophisticated use of what we saw in Nelson's Minding the Dispatch, where there you saw a set of trends that looked like they were interesting to drill down on. Here the authors have drilled down and actually used this to demonstrate a change in how something is being covered over time. And 4, to simply that different newspapers varied in their coverage of government arts patronage. All right, so in the 4th example we're going to look at, it's the paper by Baron, Huang, Spang, and Didio, 2019, on the French Revolution, which is really quite an amazing paper in its use of the concept of entropy applied to topic models to talk about how the French Revolution was able to transition from a monarchy to a more deliberative democracy, and really providing a perspective on the function of government from an information theoretical perspective. It's very rich, and we're only going to be able to touch on the surface of this. But I really challenge you to look at that article and, when you have time later, read it several times and get as much out of it methodologically as you can. The same with the DiMaggio article. And the others as well, but this is really kind of a tour de force. So the argument is about the French Revolution. So the context is the French Revolution and the idea that it signified a major shift in European political organization. This is uncontroversial, that with the French Revolution, immediately following the American Revolution and the development of the liberal democratic model, you see a shift in not just who takes over. It's not just about what kind of people are in power, whether they're aristocrats or bourgeois. It really has to do with how governments function in a very fundamental way, even though there are commonalities to the previous forms of political organization. So the context is that you have the collapse of the Ancien regime, known as the Three Estates, and the replacement by what's called a constitutional republic. With Napoleon thrown in there, which they don't spend a lot of time talking about, but they're focusing more on the transitional stage with the National Constituent Assembly, which was instrumental in this process. So I have a quick slide here just to give you a feel for what's going on in terms of what kind of change is happening at the time of the French Revolution. Of course, France, before the Revolution, was ruled by a monarchy and was ruled by the three estates, members of the three estates. Essentially, you have priests, knights, and peasants. The knights being the nobles and the peasants being the farmers. And in many societies, you have this kind of triadic social organization. This is almost a universal, cultural universal, where you have monarchic organizations flanked by a priestly and a warrior class. And that was replaced by something like this. This is actually an image of the what is called the National Constituent Assembly, which is the people taking over the governing of their own destiny. We all know that the story of the French Revolution is very complicated, and that a central power figure did emerge in the form of Napoleon, but then it was reconstituted again as a republic through several phases. But let's drill down and to look at how these authors are addressing this. So they have some very specific questions about political change, because it doesn't just happen. Political change has to, the political energy that's released by revolution has to be channeled and structured in order to make good of the revolution. There are lots of examples of where revolutions fail because there is no way to sort of leverage the chaotic energy and the disruption that takes place with revolution by those leading the revolution. In the case of the French, they do achieve some level of coherency through this institution of the NCA. So the question is, how did they handle that? And specifically, we want to know, how did new ideas, because a lot of this is funneled by new ideas of how to do things. It's hard to imagine how revolutionary the French Revolution was at the time in terms of how radical the rethinking of institutions was. I mean, they were even considering things like changing clocks from having 12 hours to 10 hours, restarting the calendar from the Christian origin of the Anno Domini to a later period, the French Revolution being the zero year and that sort of thing. So how did the NCA handle innovation and keep the good ideas and get rid of the bad ideas, as it were? How did ideas enter? How are they admitted for discussion? How did they change within the NCA? And how did speakers, and this is the crucial thing, how did speakers and the developers of these new ideas, how are they able to develop novelty and yet be intelligible? So this is a real problem in human communication and in human innovation and in human cultural change, that if you want to change society, you can't be too radical for lots of reasons. For one thing, nobody knows what you're talking about. And so in order to be revolutionary, you have to have some kind of cautionary or some mitigating conservatism to make sure that what you're saying is intelligible. And this is why centrism is so important as a ground to occupy in the political process, because centrism is what people understand. Anyway, we can go off on, that's a separate set of ideas. But here, what's going on is they're building on a pretty cool theory of culture and society that's based on information theory. So what governance is defined as here is as an institution for information processing. And this is interesting because, as we know, that you probably know that information theory is closely tied to cybernetics. Both ideas were developed at the same time. In fact, Norbert Wiener's book on cybernetics, published in 1948, actually has many of the ideas that Shannon is talking about in his essay, published the same year. And cybernetics was a theory of governance in the sense of how certain homeostatic structures are able to govern themselves, literally through a governor, the way an engine has a governor and so forth. In fact, the word cybernetics is based on the word governor, the same word on which govern is based. The notion of Kuber, to steer, is the root of the word govern. And so there's actually a close semantic and structural analogy between governance in the political sense and governance in the cybernetic sense. Because at the end of the day, all societies have to institute a cybernetic feedback loop. They have to represent themselves to themselves. In many societies, this form of representation of self to self, if you will, of how a society represents itself to itself, is done through ritual. That's how a lot of kingships work. Sometimes a kingship is described as a theater state, where the function of the monarchy is to represent the people to themselves in some kind of mythic fantasy that's acted out through ongoing rituals and so forth. But at the NRC, it was done one speech at a time, as it were. It is through speech making that society communicates with itself. So you have people representing society. They enter this body of the NRC and they make a speech to influence everybody else who represents the rest of society as well. And if it's a successful speech, or if it has legs and it builds on itself and develops into a movement where laws are passed and so forth, then you can clearly see how the input of information is converted into action. And that's what a government is. And so they want to understand how this particular form of government was able to perform that process. And here I'm pulling out the classic cybernetic feedback circuit diagram that many of you may be familiar with, especially if you have a background in engineering. And you can see that all the functions of government actually map out onto this circuitry, which is often used just to describe electrical things, like a homeostat in a house and so forth. You have a responding function, you have a sensing function, and you have a comparison function. And that's what a government does. The inputs that govern the comparison function are cultural values, and the outputs are effects on society. And so this is actually a nice place to pause to think about the importance of topic modeling for what we're really trying to get at here, because we're trying to get at understanding the cultural framework within which this kind of process happens. So where are those input values coming from, those values against which environmental changes are compared before a change is made? So let's drill down and operationalize this idea with respect to what topic modeling can offer. The authors focus on three things. They focus on word use patterns, and they see these as proxies for political structures and struggles. So if you have different word use patterns in a corpus of speeches, that's going to be evidence of political difference and political struggle. In particular, topic mixtures are going to signify this kind of struggle. These topic mixtures are tied into the second assumption, which is heteroglossia, which we've already seen, which signifies political diversity and conflict within discourse. And I say here, see DiMaggio and Bly as the previous essay. And so the authors here are going to use the diversity of topic mixtures within speeches as possible evidence for heteroglossia. In other words, the need for a speech maker to be inclusive and broad-based to a certain extent, to include different voices and constituencies within the discourse. And then there's another important assumption they're making, is that we're going to be able to detect innovation in speech through the use of entropy, which we've talked about. Here I have it listed as surprise, but we've already talked about entropy earlier as being about related to the inverse probability of a statement. So when something is high entropy, it means that it's less predictable, essentially. And that's associated with change and innovation. All right, so this data on which this ambitious project is based are the speeches of the Natural Constituent Assembly, drawn from the Archives Parlementaires, dating from 1787 to 1794. And in this case, each speech is a discursive unit. So that's the unit of the bag of words. So paragraphs are combined into speeches. And what they have are 40,000 speeches over 2 years, and they got 1,000+ speakers. It's a pretty rich data set. For metadata, for each speech, they have the date of the speech, they have the speaker of the speech, they have the time order of the speech, when it happened during the day, because there's a schedule, a docket of speeches that was recorded. They have the personal traits associated with speech and the organizational roles of the speaker. So, for example, if the person's conservative or radical, whether the person is a committee chair or something like that. And also, the content has been classified as being new or in debate. In other words, whether it's newly introduced into the parliamentary proceedings, if you will, or whether it's in an ongoing debate. So that's pretty rich metadata with which to work. This is just a screenshot of the archive where the data can actually be downloaded for your own research. And here's a screenshot of what the text looks like. So what's really nice about this project also is that the texts are all encoded in TEI XML, which is the gold standard for text encoding. We've talked about it in our text model module. And this makes parsing of text a breeze. It makes it really nice. So you can see, for example, here, the metadata for this unit of discourse is very clearly laid out. You can see who the speaker is. You can see who's introducing the speaker and things like that. It's pretty nice. So the technology used, or the parameters and hyperparameters used to perform the topic modeling, they used Python LDA, which is a library that uses collapsed Gibbs. They didn't use Mallet. They focus on the 10,000 most frequent terms. They're not using TF-IDF apparently. It's not clear from their presentation whether they are using TF-IDF. And they have a topic model of 100 topics. They set the alpha value to 0.1 and the beta value to 0.01. And what they do in their analysis is that they read the topic mixtures. Remember, that's the theta table. The theta table is basically a document topic table. So for each row is a document, and each element in that row or vector is the concentration of topics, the values of which sum up to 1. They read these as a proxy for speech patterns. So the vector of a speech is related to the pattern of the speech. So I point out here that it's not really a speech pattern in the sense that a sociolinguist would consider a speech pattern, but it has some kinds of relationship to it, and we're just going to go with it because the results seem interesting. And so the idea is to take speeches that happen relative to each other in time and use KL divergence to measure how different they are to each other. So if a speech happens and another speech happens, how much difference is one speech to another? And how much difference is one speech to its neighbors across a certain window? And in looking at this, they're looking at 3 different measures: novelty, transience, and resonance. And we'll talk about those in mathematical terms in a second. They explore relations to other factors through average values for labels, i.e., for example, political affiliation, organizational role, and so forth. We saw that already, how you can talk about the relationship between a topic and some label through the averaging of topics associated with the documents that are grouped by that label. Okay. So here's the KL divergence equation that we saw earlier in our discussion of entropy and in our discussion of similarity. It's one way to measure distance, although it's an asymmetric measure, and to make it symmetric, you use Jensen-Shannon divergence, which is a way of normalizing this. But what they do is they take the current speech, which is P, and the compared speech, which is Q, and they get the divergence of the two just by plugging in the probabilities according to the equation that you see there, which is pretty straightforward. So remember that KLD, another word for it is relative entropy. So you're looking at how much entropy does one speech have relative to another. Here's the author's representation of that same equation. I just point out that they use non-canonical or incorrect notation with that pipe, because that pipe doesn't stand for conditional probability. It stands for the divergence between speech J and speech J-1 in the timeline. Here is their measure of novelty and transience. So novelty is just the KL divergence of a bunch of speeches from W being the length of a window. So a window might be 5. So over a period of 5 speeches, you just sum up the difference of entropy between each speech and its previous, and you get the basically the average of that. And W, of course, is a variable that you can change. So novelty is just the average KLD for a speech within a window of past speeches. Transience uses the same formula, but with a window of future speeches. So you have novelty and transience, which has to do with how new something is versus how long something lasts. So if something is new relative to what follows, or rather, let's say, if something has a greater relative entropy according to what follows, that means people forgot about it, right? If it's got a greater relative entropy relative to what precedes it, that means it's innovative. Okay, so what they're measuring here is a speech innovative, and did it stick? Right? Those are what these 2 measures are providing. And resonance combines the 2. So it's basically the difference between novelty and transient. So what that does is measure, okay, did this new idea stick? You might call it sticking power or staying power. They're calling it resonance. So resonance is high if a speech is new but persists, and low if the reverse. So if N is a lot greater than T, then the speech was effective and innovative. So that's the basic key idea here. And here's a diagram they show to explain their idea. So novelty concerns the KL divergence of the speech as preceding the current speech, and transience concerns the KL divergence relative to the speech following the current speech. And then you combine the two. So this figure that they present in the essay pretty much summarizes their application of the model that you just saw to the data. Let's look at the figure on the left. So that just shows it's a scatter plot of novelty versus transiency, or transience. And you can see that there's a little square box in the lower part of the image, in the lower part of the image here. And that refers to speeches that have this quality of having high novelty and low transience, which is what you're looking for. These are speeches that are new and had some kind of staying power. And here in the middle, you see the zoom in of the entropy, relative entropy of the KLD of the center speech relative to the N minus, or what is it, J minus 1 and J plus 1, J minus N and J plus N. And so you can see there's a difference, right? There's relative to the new, to the previous ones, it's novel, and then it has staying power. Now, what they want to do then is apply this principle of, this combined measure of resonance, of novelty, no resonance. And so you do see a trend line upward. And then you can see that little square appearing here, which puts it in an intuitively better place. So now we can see this measure provides us with a nice description of this value that we're looking for. So it's above the line, and these are the kinds of speeches that you're looking for. So the figures that we just looked at describe the overall state of the system. And what they show is that the system has an overall innovation bias, which indicates that the system is in disequilibrium. And if the system is in disequilibrium, that means it's changing, it's evolving. It's going through what physicists might call a phase change. And that, is consistent with what we know politically is happening. There is a society that is evolving. And it's a very fraught process that could go out of control. It could achieve chaos, achieve a level, a state which where things sort of fall apart and you have blood on the streets. In fact, there are, if you look at the French Revolution, there are lots of cases of political breakdown. And what's interesting is you have, in this system, they point out that the conservatives act as dampeners in the process, which, just as a side note, is a really interesting way of looking at the political process. What the information theoretic view provides is this notion that conservatives and progressives, conservatives and radicals, actually kind of need each other for the system as a whole to function, which is really an interesting perspective given how we tend to view political parties as autonomous and adversarial, and each one really trying to gain total control of the system. In fact, it's kind of how in our polarized political culture today, I think each party kind of sees itself as wanting to get all the marbles, as it were. But what this is showing is that, in fact, they need each other. So you can imagine a contrary situation. If it's completely dominated by conservatives, you end up with this stasis, this steady state that leads to no innovation, and where you might have breakdown due to other causes, the system unable to adapt to changes and so forth. But that's just a side note here. We're really kind of interested in pushing this thesis or this observation a little further and drilling down. So the system innovation bias that the authors discover predicts high novelty speakers also have the highest resonance. So they want to make a claim now about the effectiveness of speeches and correlating novelty to resonance. And they want to do this with respect to three different categories. So which group of people achieve this value of having high novelty and high resonance? And so they look at three roles. They look at the role of the orator, the role of a president, regardless of who occupies that role, and they look at the role of committee proxies. And they apply to these particular roles. They want to get to this measure of delta resonance. They're doing all this in z-scores, by the way. That's what the z means there, just simple statistics. And what the ZR stands for is just the speaker group's mean resonance. So we talked about how you can get the mean value of an aggregate of values just by taking the label and doing a group by and getting the mean, and there you have it. So here you get all the speakers associated with, say, orator, and you just simply get the mean of their resonance, and that's what that ZR stands for. But we want to normalize it, as it were, or condition it on comparing it to the overall novelty resonance relationship of the system as a whole, and that's what that trend line in figure 1 stands for. And so once you subtract these two, you get a more realistic value of the extent to which the speaker broke system level trends to achieve their effects, and that's what they're really looking for. And in that particular, they show the results of this in Table 1 in the paper, and they use a pretty wide window of 36. And by the way, the W value changes a lot in their analyses. Sometimes it's just a couple. Sometimes it's, I think they have one case where they're measuring W equals like 3,000, where they're looking at months in advance and months following in terms of speeches. So the idea is that a speaker may have high novelty and high resonance, but still have this negative delta value, which means that sometimes adventurousness is not rewarded. So they're trying to condition just looking at the raw sort of adventurousness, if you will, of a speaker relative to whether it was successful in the overall system. And the result that they end up with is this. They show that among the groups that they're looking at, and this is actually a drill down even further from the 3 groups that we looked at, they have on the left, they show that the right-wing estates, the first and second estates in the old system, have high resonance but low novelty. Okay, so that means that their speeches tend to be persistent, they have staying power, but they're not very novel, which makes sense. Those are successful conservative speeches right there. And on the right upper corner, we have the left wing, which has high resonance and high novelty. The third estate, committees, and it makes a lot of sense that this would be the case, because that's what, in a way, the left aspires to being, is introducing change. It's one of the reasons why one of the synonyms for liberal in our political discourse is progressive. This idea of progressing things, innovating things. And then you have, in the lower right, you have the president, who is kind of in the worst of all possible worlds here, who has very low resonance and high innovation, or high novelty rather.